Welcome to Early Returns, hosted by Jan Baran, a partner of Holtzman Vogel. This podcast examines law and politics and seeks insights from political players in elections, lobbying, media, and the law. Now, let's join our host, Jan Baran.
Welcome back to Early Returns, a podcast about law and politics. I'm your host, Jan Baran. Our producer is Jody Mayer Piazza. Today's episode will cover law, politics, and diplomacy. Combination is a little unusual because of the diverse background of my guests. Former Governor of Virginia, Jim Gilmore, served as Attorney General of the Commonwealth, was then elected governor. He practiced law and then eventually ran for other offices, including senator and president. His most recent public service was as the U.S. ambassador to an international organization headquartered in Vienna, Austria. Governor Gilmore's interesting career and public service span over 40 years. During that time, he has seen changes in his native Virginia, in Republican politics, and in public service. Governor, thank you for coming on the program and being willing to share your experiences and observations. Welcome.
Thank you, John. Appreciate the opportunity to be with you.
Well, Governor, as I said, you're a native Virginian. That goes even back to where you grew up, went to college and law school at the University of Virginia, and then somehow wedged in a few years in the U.S. Army, where you served in counterintelligence. With that background, how did you ultimately get involved in politics? What got you triggered in politics?
I'll try to keep this short, but in high school, as I was coming along and developing, all I ever really did was play music. I was a clarinet player. I played in orchestras. I played in bands. I went to Europe with a major concert band. On that concert tour, the lead soloist was a clarinetist. And I listened to him and I said, I'm never going to be that good. He's just gifted and there's nothing I could do about that. So I came back to Virginia and I said, well, what should I be doing? So I started to cast about. The adult supervisor of my key club said, I'm running for the legislature and I'd like you to help me. And I said, I don't know anything about it, but I'll try. So he assigned me a precinct. I went door to door. I visited with every voter in that precinct. And when it was over with, I said, okay, this is it. This is what I can do. He said to me, okay, I'm going to get you over now and get you to join the Young Democrats, and we're going to work from there. And I said, no, I'm going to UVA. I'm joining the Young Republicans, and I'm never looking back. And so I became a Republican when I was 17. And basically, I think that's when I entered politics.
Well, Virginia was a pretty Democratic state at that time. What attracted you to the Republican Party?
I think things were changing at that time, Jan. We were beginning to see the emergence of national media, of national television shows, of national politics. And I came to understand that really I was not a Democrat. We had this anomalous situation where the bird machine was still running things, and they were very conservative in all areas. But they were Democrats, and I was a national Republican. I became very committed to Richard Nixon and to national Republican politics, and I had to live in both worlds. But of course, I also found that the Democrats in Virginia were quite arrogant because they were operating under the presumption of the old bird machine, which grew out of the Reconstruction period, that said that they were going to rule Virginia in perpetuity. And that was not something I was committed to because I became a Republican.
You succeeded Republican Governor George Allen, as I recall, when you were elected governor. You were really kind of in the mix of an ascendancy of Republicans in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And during your tenure as governor, you nonetheless had a Democratic legislature, House of Delegates and State Senate. But you got a lot accomplished. You really did turn around several important things during your tenure. What do you consider to be the most important lasting results of your term as governor?
Well, again, I was the Attorney General at the time, so I was already a statewide elected official. And when I ran, I knew as a conservative, a true blue conservative, that I really wanted to run on a tax cut if I could. Americans pay a lot of taxes at the national and the state and local level. And I felt like that this was a place where I could make a difference by being a conservative tax cutter. So we decided that we wanted to run against the car tax in Virginia. It took the state by storm. It ignited the voting public, and they swept me into office. And once I was in office, I implemented a phase out of the car tax over 5 years. And I must say that was a mistake because you only get to stay as governor for 4. So once there was some remnant of it still left after I was gone, the Democrats came in after me and slowly began to reassert the car tax. But I considered that tax cut and the elimination of most of the car tax as one of my abiding accomplishments. Above that, I had become to understand, particularly in Northern Virginia, the impact that the emerging technology community was having, and was interested in making Virginia a cutting-edge 21st century state and moving the state into the 21st century through the technology community. So I put a Secretary of Technology in my cabinet, began to appear in all of the conferences, work internationally, and tried to develop that. Besides economic development, Jan, I would say that the thing perhaps that I think has been the most enduring was a political accomplishment. And that was that I carried into the office a true resentment of the sense of the Democratic Party that it was going to always control Virginia, that even if Republicans made an advance, they were going to just redistrict people back down again, and that they would always control Virginia like an aristocracy. I was determined to change that. So I worked to bring the first Republican majorities into the state Senate and the House of Delegates in the history of Virginia, at least since Reconstruction. And I succeeded. There are mechanisms that I used to do that, but at the end of the day, I brought in the first Republican majorities in both of those houses. And I think that what the intention was not to create a permanent Republican majority, but to create a new politics in the state where it would go back and forth and the public would have a genuine choice. And I think I've accomplished that, sometimes to my grief and sometimes to my happiness, but it, I think, fundamentally changed the politics of Virginia for all time.
Well, Virginia has changed in that regard in terms of swinging a little back and forth between Republican control and Democratic control. In the recent election, it swung to Democratic control, where one of the houses was in Republican control. And it also swung from a Democratic governor back to a Republican governor. And in presidential elections, however, I don't think it has voted for a Republican presidential nominee, if I'm correct, since George Bush, which is now almost 20 years ago. It is 20 years ago. Why is there, in your opinion, a little flexibility in terms of Commonwealth partisan politics and control, but seems to be pretty democratic when it comes to presidential campaigns?
Well, I think what I would say to your listeners is that you have to think about politics in several different capacities. One is demographics. And once again, the professional politicians know about demographics and they redistrict districts based upon demographics. In Virginia, we are very diverse. If you campaign statewide, you really come to understand how different the regions are in Virginia. It's a very big state and very diverse. So you have Northern Virginia, you have the Richmond community, the Hampton Roads Maritime area, Southside farming and the Shenandoah Valley and farming, and then finally the mountainous far west part of the state. And the demographics are all different in those different places. I think that what we're seeing today is the tremendous growth of Northern Virginia, particularly Fairfax County, and of course Arlington and Alexandria as well. And these communities tend to want to vote more moderate to liberal. And that, because they're so populous, that is dominating the statewide politics. On the other hand, there's the second aspect. And the second aspect is, what are the issues and how the people of Virginia care about it? So, for example, when I ran on the car tax cut, that was enormously popular in Fairfax County and all of Northern Virginia. I won Northern Virginia in my statewide campaign because of that, and I was elected. Glenn Youngkin, on the other hand, had another issue, and that was at the time that he was running, the issue of state control of education and the indoctrination of students within the schools in the new woke technology was emerging. There was a rebellion going on by the parents. It was mostly promoted in Loudoun County. There was a violent pushback by the parents. Glenn Youngkin saw that, understood it, grabbed onto it, and made it clear that he was going to put more parental involvement in the classrooms. I might mention, since I'm on this topic, that Terry McAuliffe, went right back out and said that in his opinion, the parents really had no role in the classrooms, which was really not a good thing to do. Number one rule of Gilmore in politics is this: when you see a buzzsaw, don't walk into it. And that's what Terry did. And Glenn Youngkin was elected on that platform. So issues do matter and demographics matter. And those are the two things that I think drive Virginia right now.
You mentioned McAuliffe, and he was an unusual candidate in the sense that he is a former governor. He had a term before Youngkin, before Northam. And Virginia, for our listeners who are not very familiar necessarily with the intricacies of Virginia law regarding holding office, is the last state that does not permit a governor to run for re-election in consecutive terms. So Terry McAuliffe sat out a term, and then he decided he was going to run for governor again, and that did not work out very well. You never did attempt to run for another term for governor. What do you think about this constitutional provision that limits governors to one term or two terms, but not consecutive? Is that practical? How does that work? What does it do to somebody who's a governor once they're elected and everyone knows they're only there for 4 years?
Well, I think it's the stupidest thing I've ever heard of. And I have come out in public and have said that I believe that the Constitution should be amended so that the governor has an opportunity to run for a second term. Now, if he's unpopular, he won't be elected. That's the national model. If the governor is not popular, he won't be reelected. But if he is, he gets at that point an opportunity to carry out his programs for 8 years. And you really need to be able to do that in the modern world. You can't really do anything serious in transportation in 4 years, for example. You can start things, but you can't finish things. I still remember during my administration in transportation, my 4 years, I actually got moving on the Woodrow Wilson Bridge across the Potomac River. We put all of it in place. We acquired all the property. We got all the financing in place, and then I was gone. And so when it was finally over with, I still remember Governor Kane riding a car across the Woodrow Wilson Bridge and taking credit for it. The point is that it's a bad idea, and I think that we ought to have that opportunity to run for re-election.
Well, what does it take to change the Constitution, and what's the likelihood that could happen?
It is impossible. It requires the legislature to pass a constitutional amendment. There has to be an intervening election, and then they come back in as a new legislature, and they have to pass the same constitutional provision again, word for word. Then it goes on a referendum. And if it's then passed by the referendum, you can change the Constitution in that way. Besides the cumbersome process, Jan, the legislature likes having the governor leave every 4 years. How many times have the grandes in the legislature said to me, you're here for 4 years, but we're here forever? That is a very difficult thing. It disempowers the governor, and I think that's a bad law. I might say, by the way, that I have fun with it. I say that based on my experience, the governor of Virginia, in the first year, the legislature will do anything you ask them to do because you just got elected by the public. In the second year, the legislature is cordial. In the third year, they are not cordial. And in the fourth year, they're trying to kill you. I think that law needs to change.
Well, I think Governor Youngkin is experiencing a little bit of that today. After your service as governor, you tried getting back into office, as I mentioned a couple times. One was a race for United States Senator in which you lost to a former governor who was a Democratic nominee. And then you ran for president. That was in 2016 when there were 17 candidates for president. So you were part of a pretty large field. How do you compare those experiences running for those federal offices to what you experienced running for governor statewide in Virginia?
Well, putting aside for a moment the fact that the policy matrix are entirely different. Putting that aside for a moment, you can decide if you're running for state office what you think your program ought to be and what you want to try to implement, and the same if you're going to try to run for federal office. But in my case, things were quite different. When I ran for governor, as I said, that was my second foray into statewide office. I was already a statewide office holder as Attorney General. I knew what I wanted to do. I ran on a defined platform with the car tax cut. It was frankly a great experience because at that point, you really understand the entire state and all of its people and what their concerns are. And I remember talking to people when I was running for statewide office who were working second jobs and just to try to make ends meet. And That's one reason why I wanted to stay with my plan for a car tax cut. Federal office, that race was different. That was a race I should not have run. I thought, having kept my word as a car tax cutter, that would carry a lot of weight in Virginia. But there were other pressures there. I was running against a popular former governor. I was a popular former governor. He was a popular former governor. He was the immediate past governor. I was one or two back. So it was a difference there. But the real point was that was a presidential year. And Barack Obama was running for president that year against John McCain. When I entered that race, I thought McCain would carry Virginia in good old Virginia tradition, and that Barack Obama would never have a chance to carry Virginia. Well, he did carry Virginia. He carried it strongly. Once the president carries Virginia as a Democrat, the Republican candidate, it's impossible for him to win. So that was a difference. But what I'm really describing to you is just the ebb and flow of politics, what works and what doesn't.
I also observed that the rules are a little different in terms of campaigning in Virginia versus campaigning for senator when it comes to campaign finance. Virginia has very few restrictions on raising money if you're running for statewide office. And whatever you raise, you got to disclose so everyone knows it. But that does seem to make historically quite a difference in governors. They often are people like yourself who come from relatively modest backgrounds. They're successful. They're not wealthy individuals. They have to depend on getting funding and financial support in whatever amounts they can garner to finance a successful campaign. When it comes to running for senator, unless you are personally wealthy, you can only raise money in increments of about $3,000 a pop. Did that make a difference? Was that a visible difference when you were running for senator in 2008?
It was a very visible difference. The Virginia system, I think, is better because at that point you can raise unlimited funds. That's true, and you can begin to get the wherewithal to run a statewide campaign, which in a place like Virginia is quite big. On the other hand, on the federal side, yes, it's correct. I was running against Governor Warner, but on the other hand, Governor Warner was extremely wealthy. That financial backing that he had made it easier for him to raise money from other people that wanted to contribute to him. We can introduce a longer topic at a later time, but I believe that the national federal campaign laws are just crazy. I think that it's very restrictive. It is true that you can work through a PAC, but the PAC, you can't work directly with the PAC. That's illegal, and that's crazy. The campaign finance limits were intended to limit the role of very wealthy people. It has failed completely to do that. I think today American politics is based upon the ability to buy advertising, which means that the oligarchs in America who are willing to contribute large sums of money through an artificial PAC dominate. Not to mention, by the way, the fact that you nominate now by primary and not by conventions in America, which means that the parties really don't nominate their candidates at all. The public does through primaries. So that's, I think, a problem because people who participate in politics really don't get a chance to name the candidates anymore.
Once you dropped out of the presidential race in 2016, you endorsed then candidate Donald Trump. I understand that you have already endorsed him for this campaign in 2024. And as I've mentioned, no Republican presidential candidate has carried Virginia since 2004. Trump didn't in 16. He didn't do it in 20. Nobody here is predicting he'll do it in this election. What's behind your thinking about endorsing former President Trump?
Well, a few things. First of all, since you mentioned it, let me say that I don't regret running for president in 2016. Believe me, it was an enormously pleasant, well, it was hard work. It was miserable in a lot of ways. All these things about running through the snow in New Hampshire, that's all true. I have the pictures. But it was a wonderful experience of a lifetime, and it was the right time for me to run, even though it was challenging and it was a large field. Second of all, no, I'm not going to support a Democrat, particularly this iteration of the Democratic Party, which is very strange. It would be impossible for me to support this culturally left-wing, strange party that would be the Democratic Party. I wouldn't do it anyway. Let's be realistic here. President Trump submitted himself to the voters in multiple primaries. He won every primary. The Republican voters of the United States of America have spoken. President Trump is going to be the nominee. So then you're confronted. Are you going to go off and support a strange left-wing party you've never supported before in your whole life? Or are you going to stick with your party and try to speak out on the issues in my own way and support President Trump? And that's what I'm doing. And I'm pleased to be doing it, as a matter of fact. I hope that on issues like foreign policy that I can, in fact, make a difference. I'm speaking very loudly right now on my own brief as to what I think is the right foreign policy. And I'm continuing to do that now. Hopefully that President Trump will feel the same way as he goes on and becomes the president.
Well, your last service in government was in diplomacy and foreign affairs. You were the U.S. ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which in diplomacy is known by its shorthand, OSCE. It is an important multinational organization that was formed during the Cold War and monitors security issues, human rights, freedom of the press, and, of course, free and fair elections. Tell our listeners a little bit about OSCE because it's not really well known here in the U.S., quite prominent in Europe. What was your role when you were the U.S. ambassador to that organization?
Well, first of all, once you're the United States ambassador appointed by the president and then confirmed by the United States Senate, you carry tremendous weight in diplomatic circles. The OSCE consists of 57 countries. It's basically everything in the Northern Hemisphere, all of Eastern Europe, all of Western Europe, the Baltic countries, the Scandinavian countries, the Balkans, and it crosses the Atlantic and picks up Canada and the United States. But it also contains Central Asian countries and notably both Ukraine as a country and Russia. All of them are in the OSCE. It has a rich history. It grew out of a time when there was an agreement between the United States and Russia, at least to the rules of the road. The Russians have been participating ever since that time. As United States ambassador, you speak on behalf of our country. At the time that I was ambassador, we met every Thursday at the Hofburg Palace in downtown Vienna, all 57 ambassadors, and then you spoke on behalf of your country. And usually the big players spoke every week, the British, the French, the Germans, the Americans, the Ukrainians, and the Russians, and others. During the week, I had a chance to have private meetings with other ambassadors, both friends and adversaries, to try to work out diplomacy and find out where we all are. I think the OSCE is unknown. It's also a missed opportunity. I think it's a great opportunity for American diplomacy, very similar to the United Nations. As ambassador, I did follow the leadership of my president. I never subsumed America's national interest into any organization or any other country. But at the same time, I came to understand something, Jan, and that is the United States is strong because we do have allies. We're in a war right now. It's going on globally. I think that we're more likely to be able to win this war if we continue to work with our allies. America first does not mean America alone. We have friends, and as long as we provide leadership, America is always the big player, and we should provide that leadership, and that's what I learned at OSCE.
You mentioned that Ukraine and Russia are member nations of OSCE. Your term as ambassador ended before the current war started. But during your time there, what was it like dealing with the Ukrainians and Russians? Were they already at each other's throat? How did that affect the OSCE?
Well, yes, they were at each other's throats, and the United States was supportive of Ukraine each and every day and each and every week. And as I said, I met with the Ukrainian ambassador every week in order to talk to him about the issues. The status at that time was that the Russians in 2014 had already invaded Ukraine. They had pulled out and reached an agreement which they thought was going to mean they would dominate Ukraine. It didn't work that way. And so then they used little green men to overtake Crimea. The Americans had a weak response at that time. President Obama let it go. That, in my judgment, encouraged Putin. He then sent his little green men into eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk and that area there. And then finally, through proxies and through advisors and through real interventions, more or less occupied eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainian country never agreed to that. As a matter of fact, if you look back on diplomatic history, you'll find that there was the Budapest Memorandum at the time that the Ukrainians gave up their nuclear weapons after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. That was on President Clinton's and American encouragement. Well, at that time that they gave up their nuclear weapons, there was a strict guarantee of their sovereignty and their borders given, guaranteed by the United States, Great Britain, and Russia. That was all violated by the Russians when they invaded. Now, they had already done that occupation, and we were dealing with that every day while I was there as ambassador. After I left, in my judgment, President Biden, I believe, made at least 5 mistakes and sent the message to President Putin that if he invaded Ukraine, that would be okay. And so he did. And that invasion occurred, of course, after I left. I might mention in passing that I also had an opportunity to visit Ukraine in 2021 in May, right after I left the ambassadorship of May of 21. And I had a chance to visit with all the departments in Ukraine. I had a chance to travel down to a city called Mariupol, which is presently under Russian occupation. I had a chance to go to the front line and look and see what that was all about. I came to understand that Ukraine is a country, and therefore my attitude about this is defined by that. The Russians are trying to extinguish a country. And if they do that, that changes all the rules in Europe and worldwide, and I believe sets us up for a third world war. I would like that to not occur, and that's why I'm so supportive of Ukraine now.
What is it going to take for Ukraine to defeat Russia? And what is the likely outcome of this war between the Ukrainians and the Russians? Is it a stalemate? Is it something negotiated? One going to win and the other one going to lose?
Very complicated situation. Let me say several things about this. First of all, I think we have to define what winning means. If, in fact, it means that the Ukrainians have to actually, in a military way, push the Russians back out of all of Ukraine, including Crimea, that is a very heavy lift. I wouldn't rule it out, by the way. I think if they were properly supported by the Americans first and the Europeans, then I think it's possible, because I don't think Russia is really 10 feet tall the way people see them. I think that their propaganda is working on the minds of the American people. I think it's working on the minds of some members of Congress. But I do think that it's possible. But on the other hand, winning might not require them to today drive the Russians out of their territory. Just simply refusing to agree to the conquest and continuing to oppose the Russians, both militarily and otherwise. That could be winning. I believe that Ukraine's future is, in fact, to be sovereign. I remind your listeners right now that Putin's goal was the extinction and destruction totally of the Ukrainian country. When he invaded, he actually was trying to draw his forces into Kyiv. He was going to occupy the country totally. He was going to then imprison or murder any of the people that were not in favor of Russia. He has failed in all that, and he can't succeed in that, at least not as long as the United States and the Europeans are behind the Ukrainians, as in fact that vote, as in the recent days, has shown that we are prepared to give some financial support and continue to support the existence of the Ukrainian country.
How much support do you believe the European allies are giving to Ukraine? And what form is it taking? Are they giving the same degree of military support that seems to be necessary for the Ukrainians to wage a war? Basically, they have to dislodge the Russians from parts of their own country.
Which, as I said, is a very heavy lift, not impossible, but I think that's not going to be done overnight. The last time they tried a counteroffensive, the Americans were not really sending the money and their arms necessary. So they did not succeed, which is very demoralizing. But the fact is, this war is going to go on, in my opinion, for quite a long time. Now, let me say several things. The Europeans are putting in more money than the Americans. The Europeans are putting in more money than the Americans. So this disinformation that we see, both from the Russians and from certain Americans, that the Americans are putting in hundreds of billions of dollars and we're the only people doing anything, is factually not true. Secondly, it is true that the United States is putting in most of the military arms, but that's because we have the most military arms. President Trump has been working to try to get the Europeans to build up their militaries. President Trump was successful in that regard, or is being successful. But right now, the Americans are the ones that have the most military resources and the best sophistication technology, and we are the ones that are contributing the most of that. But the third point I would make to your listeners is to bear in mind what hybrid warfare really means. Hybrid warfare is everything. It's armies in the field, it's cyber, it's misinformation, it's propaganda, and its economy. If you can destroy the economy of your adversary, you destroy the adversary. We learned that in World War II when we bombed the German population and their factories and their military plants and their resources, and we blockaded their ability to trade. If a country cannot support its military economically or its population economically, they lose the war. So there's a combination of resources that are going into Ukraine right now to allow them to exist and resist this Russian aggression that's going on.
I think Ronald Reagan observed that when he was president and building up the U.S. military capabilities against Russia. Russia could not keep up and also could not sustain a war in Afghanistan. And after 9 years, they had to withdraw. They could not sustain the war in Afghanistan and could not sustain their own economy at that time, which did lead to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. You obviously were quite engaged in all of these issues as ambassador. How do you stay involved now that you are back in the private sector? What are you doing with respect to Ukraine, if anything, and what else are you doing?
I am seeing right now my primary mission is to, in fact, support Ukraine in this war and to stop the Russian aggression. That is the primary thing that I'm doing. So I'm giving speeches. I'm doing writing right now. I just looked at it last night. I actually began to write on this subject way back in 2021 when I came back from Vienna. And I've written multiple articles about this. You could see it coming for years. I've given speeches by the hundreds on this issue, and that is what I believe my highest and best use is. I have the experience as governor, as RNC chairman, as ambassador, and I think I have a role that I can play right now as a conservative Republican. I'm very concerned, of course, about the political environment in America today, and I believe I can make a contribution in talking about that. But the ambassadorship was a very rich experience. It gave me a credential to understand these issues, and that's what I'm doing.
Thank you for that, and thank you for your service in so many different ways to public office, and not to mention your military service. I always like to acknowledge guests who have served in the military, which is now more important than ever. I always like to inquire of my guests, particularly those who travel a lot and might have the opportunity to do some extensive reading, whether they have any reading recommendations for our listeners. How about you? What would you tell our listeners to take a look at these days on some of these topics that we just discussed?
I read all the time. I gobble up books all the time. It's one of my major pieces of recreation that I really do. I guess it's just an intellectual curiosity that I've gotten from my years of both experience and education that I'm satisfying by reading. So the direct answer is this. First of all, I think that people ought to read a book called Conservative Internationalism by Henry Now, former professor at George Washington University. Right now, we're engaged in a real debate in America about what America's foreign policy ought to be. You have different pigeonholes that people get into. And I'm not really very happy with any of them, to tell you the truth. I'm not a liberal. I'm by no means an isolationist. I believe the isolationist movement right now in the Republican Party is completely destructive and probably will take us to war. So I've been looking for something different. And I think conservative internationalism is a good approach. I would suggest that you read The Final Act by a fellow by the name of Morgan. Let me see, I've got the book right over here. His name is Michael Cody Morgan. It's a very unknown book, but it tells the history basically of the negotiations that led to the OSCE and the principles that stands for, which I think are current today.
That would be part of the Helsinki Accords, right?
That is exactly right. The Helsinki Accords led to the OSCE, and they were the good start. And that is, by the way, what Putin is determined to destroy today.
Just going to add, Governor, that the Helsinki Accords were really negotiated ultimately by then President Ford and Leonid Brezhnev, I think, were the two leads on that.
Exactly right. Brezhnev at that point, a very interesting guy. Brezhnev at that point said, look, I'm not going to be able to hang on to this Soviet empire. People are just too restive. We don't have enough money. I got to get the West to agree to my empire. So he went into the negotiation to try to preserve his empire. The West at that point, it's true that Ford was president at the time, but the West at that point said, okay, here's what we'll do. We'll concede your borders, but you got to agree to human rights, openness, books, literature, travel, no longer restrict your citizens to being prisoners in your own country. We want openness. Well, openness prevailed, and the Soviet Union collapsed, I think, because of the Helsinki Accords. A third book that I really think that people might look at is a book called The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton. She is explaining exactly what the far left is thinking about in terms of economics right now. Her basic thrust of her book is that deficits don't matter. Just print the money. As long as you're in charge of your currency, just print the money. I will tell you that I am offering this book because it is completely and utterly wrong. And I think that people ought to try to understand what the Democrats are thinking. Then I would recommend two more books that I think are key to understanding Russia. One is The Great Terror by Robert Conquest. It's a very difficult book to read, but once you get into it and you understand what Stalin was really doing, you understand what Russia could become under Vladimir Putin. And the last book is Anne Applebaum's book, Red Famine. If you read that, you understand what the Russians can do to a country like Ukraine. They almost destroyed all the people of Ukraine during the Holodomor that she describes in Red Famine. Those would be the five that I think I'd recommend.
That's very impressive, and I'm grateful that you sort of contained a number of reading recommendations that you have because you are such an extensive reader and got it winnowed down to five. But when we have you back for a further discussion at a further episode, we will expect even more recommendations on your book reading. Well, I want to thank you, Governor, for your reading suggestions and for your insights on law and politics. Thanks also to our producer, Jody Mayer Piazza, and to the Holtzman Vogel Law Firm for its support of this program. Any opinions expressed on this show are those of the host, that's me, and our guests, do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors or their clients. All of our episodes are available on Buzzsprout, Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts, and other streaming platforms. I hope our listeners will have a good day and will join us again on the next episode of Early Returns. Goodbye.
Thanks for joining Early Returns, Law and Politics with Jan Baran. We hope you will join us for future episodes, which will continue to bring you voices and insights from the people engaged in our political landscape.